like to invite to the stage someone who's taken a particularly heroic stance in defending us against torture. He's serving as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on torture. He's also a fellow academic and a professor at the University of Glasgow and holds the Human Rights Chair at the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights in Switzerland, Professor Nils Melzer.
Thank you, and thank you for organizing this event. It's good to see fewer and fewer empty seats. And it's good to see more and more representatives of the press being interested. I have said many things about this case. I have come a long way myself in this case, and I've written many things about this case. I'd like to start with a metaphor that I have used yesterday and at other events, and that describe to me and help us understand what's really going on here. This room is big enough to house a couple of elephants, but let's just say we have one elephant in the room. You switch off the lights, it's pitch dark. The elephant is over there in the corner. And now I take a flashlight and I point over in that dark room. I take a flashlight and I point in the other corner. Where will all of you be looking? The other corner, right? Now Julian Assange has taken the flashlight in that dark room and he pointed at the elephant. The elephant of war crimes, the elephant of misconduct under the color of law, the elephant of serious violations of human rights and impunity. He's pointed his spotlight at this elephant, and the elephant, as a deer in the headlights, was frozen for a couple of moments, a couple of weeks. Everybody was discussing these revelations. But then the elephant snatched the spotlight and they turned it over and pointed it at Julian Assange. The room became dark, and the only thing we could see in the room is Julian Assange in the corner and the spotlight pointing at him. And now everybody was discussing Julian Assange's character, Julian Assange's private habits. Was he wearing shorts or long pants during his video conferences? Was he skateboarding in the embassy? Did he feed his cat? Did he smear things on the walls of the embassy? I mean, absolutely trivial things compared to the revelations that he made. Who is the one that has the spotlight? It's certainly the governments and the media. The media are the link. The media are the ones that observe the governments for us and then are supposed to inform us, to empower us, not just to entertain us. But if the media wants to talk about skateboards, we just want to read about skateboards. We're not looking at the elephant in the dark. And I think this is what this is about. This is why everybody's discussing, is Julian Assange a good man or a bad man? Or what has he done? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Or could someone have been endangered potentially? No one has ever heard of anyone being harmed by the revelations, but theoretically it could be harmful, so we have to extradite him to face justice. But no one discusses the people that were murdered on film. They were not endangered, they were murdered. And you can hear and you can hear the soldiers commenting. Now, I've been a legal advisor for the International Committee of the Red Cross. I've worked in war areas, and I know that civilians can arm themselves, can become dangerous, and become legitimate targets. Even if some of these people were carrying weapons, once they are wounded, they are protected. Wounded combatants cannot be targeted. Targeting wounded combatants, even if they are combatants, regardless whether they're civilians or not, once they're wounded, targeting them becomes a war crime. We can hear the soundtrack on that video. Oh, he's wounded. Fire. Yes, and then here comes the minibus. The driver wants to rescue these people, and then they're asking for permission to engage, knowing very well that they're shooting at rescuers. It's a war crime. It's not a potential war crime. It is a war crime. And who has ever asked for the prosecution of that war crime? We have the Senate committee report, 7,000 pages of evidence of systematic torture in the name of the US government. It's not true that no one has been prosecuted. There is one CIA agent that has been prosecuted for it. His name is John Kiriakou. He is the whistleblower who actually disclosed it. No one else has been prosecuted for the most serious crime of torture. So then we have, and there's evidence, I mean, that's a report by the Congress, by the Senate. That's not an NGO report, and I'm not belittling NGOs, but I'm saying this, a branch of the government recognizing that the government had a systematic policy of torture. And there is an absolute unconditional legal obligation in the Convention Against Torture that was ratified by the US to prosecute every act of torture. It has not been done. But we're prosecuting the person that has leaked the information, Chelsea Manning, and we're prosecuting the journalist who has published the information. And then the UK is doing the same. The UK was an ally, obviously, of the US in this, and the UK Parliament investigated and made a report last year, confirming that the UK involvement in the CIA torture program was much more substantial than we suspected, and asked for a judicial inquiry. Now, taking a good example of the American government, the UK government this summer cancelled out this inquiry. We're not going to prosecute. But then, in correspondence with me, the UK government claims that it doesn't condone torture. It is proud to cooperate with the UN Special Rapporteur. But when I make a report to the UK about its involvement in torture, and I ask them to investigate their own involvement, I don't receive a response for 5 months. And then I receive a one-pager saying, we reject any allegations of torture, and Julian Assange is being treated in accordance with English law. When precisely the opposite was the result of my investigation.
But it's not common law.
So, by putting a spotlight on Julian Assange, these states have deliberately created a monster, a purported rapist, narcissist, hacker, and spy. And this poisoned narrative has really intoxicated the whole public. I was intoxicated by it. I didn't even know about it. I didn't know Julian Assange. I didn't know about his case. But when his legal team approached me a bit more than a year ago in December 2018, I declined to get involved because I had this visceral reaction of, I'm not going to defend this rapist and narcissist. And I'm the special rapporteur on torture. I mean, would you think I'd be a bit more discerning? But I had this visceral reaction myself. So I'm not blaming anyone for having this initial reaction. It's natural because we absorb through the media these types of attitudes. But then when, luckily and thankfully, his legal team approached me again and sent me a couple of pieces of evidence, I started to get intrigued because I realized immediately when you scratch the surface, things don't add up. This whole narrative is not supported. It collapses. And the more you start to dig, the more dirt comes to the surface. And so I was intrigued, and I went to visit him with 2 medical doctors to have an objective basis, a psychiatrist, a forensic expert. We visited him for 4 hours. We had separate medical examinations and bilateral discussions with me, and all the 3 of us came to the conclusion that he showed clear patterns of psychological torture. I reported to the UK government thinking, well, this is the UK now. I mean, that's the rule of law. I'm just going to, they're going to investigate and we're going to sort this out and I can go home. Well, home I went, but I waited for 5 months to get this response that I told you about. And that response was just, we reject any allegations of torture. And then, obviously, Julian Assange's state of health deteriorated to the point where I was genuinely afraid he might die in prison. And let me make it very straight. Psychological torture is not torture light. Yeah? Psychological torture aims directly at destroying the personality of an individual by isolating them from all positive influences, by manipulating their feelings, exposing them to constant anxiety and stress, overstimulating their nervous system to a point where the forensic expert explained to me the nervous system simply collapses at some point and takes permanent damage, some traces of which we could already confirm in those physical examinations. I was just profoundly shocked. I could not imagine a year ago that I would ever get into a situation where a state like Sweden or a state like the UK would refuse to engage with me as the United Nations Special Rapporteur that's mandated by states to investigate cases and to ask questions to them, that they would refuse to engage with me. And then they accuse me of having lost my impartiality because I speak at events like this. Well, they're not inviting me to their offices. And I'd like to inform the public about what the government is doing. And I take pride in the objectivity of my investigation. I was reluctant to visit Julian Assange. If I was partial against him. I didn't expect to find anything, but I wanted 2 medical experts to confirm it to me. Well, they confirmed something else. And I immediately recognized the patterns myself because I've been visiting prisons for many years. I visited political prisoners in the Middle East, in the Balkans, and they all showed this type of pattern after a couple of months. So I was objective, I was neutral, I was impartial. But once I have investigated and I have identified someone as being a torture victim, I'm not neutral between the torture victim and the torturer. So, the other aspect that governments criticize me, they say, well, Mr. Melzer, this is not really in your core mandate. This is not real torture. This has nothing to do with your mandate. Well, let me just tell you, there are 3 aspects that are absolutely at the core of my mandate. This man has exposed torture, and this torture has not been prosecuted. That's a violation of the Convention Against Torture, and that's in my mandate. Secondly, this man has been tortured and continues to be tortured. Psychological torture. If anyone wants to know exactly what I mean by this, read my upcoming report. In 2 weeks it will be published to the Human Rights Council on psychological torture. Thirdly, if this man gets extradited to the United States, he will be tortured until the day he dies. Because the prison conditions in the supermax institutions amount to torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, not just by my standards, but all my predecessors, and even Amnesty International, that otherwise is not very supportive in this case, it recognizes that those conditions of detention amount to torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. There is no way he can be lawfully extradited to the United States, not because of what he has done, not because of what he will be facing there. So I think it is absolutely time for all of us to switch on our own spotlights and point it at the elephant in the room, to refuse to discuss the personality of a man who has done more than his share in serving our society, and identify and identify what really is the issue here. We cannot have states that allow unchecked power. Human beings cannot manage unchecked power. That's why we created the separation of power. That's why we created checks and balances. Now, these checks and balances, these branches of government tend to collude with each other if we don't supervise them. And that's why we have the free press that's tasked to do that. But the press that doesn't do that isn't free. It's not a press at all. It is just a public relations department of those governments. And that's why the emergence of WikiLeaks is just a natural consequence of the media failing to do their job, because someone needs to inform and empower the public. And now it is up to us, because it is about Julian Assange, but it is much more also about all of you and your children and your families. And 20 years from now, will you still be able to know the truth about what your government is doing? Or when it has become a crime to inform you about what your government is doing with your tax money to other people that have not done anything wrong in their lives? So it is up to us. We have to take our spotlights in our hands and point it at the elephant. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us today. For our young viewers in Germany, could you just briefly introduce your work and how you got involved with Julian Assange?
Yes. I'm the Special Rapporteur on Torture of the United Nations. I'm appointed by states to visit prisons, to evaluate the compliance of states with the prohibition of torture worldwide. I also deal with individual torture victims, try to protect them from torture and extradition to countries where they might be tortured. And that's exactly where I got involved with the Assange case, because he is threatened to be extradited to the United States, where human rights organizations agree that the conditions of detention that he would be facing and the trial he would be facing would be clearly unfair and amounting to torture and other cruel and human-degrading treatment.
You mentioned in your speech you had a very different opinion, and most of the people have a different opinion about Assange because most of the media focuses a lot of personal issues. Talk about what changed your opinion about Assange when you met him.
Well, when his lawyers initially asked me to intervene on his behalf with the government, I declined. And spontaneously, I had the impression, this is this narcissist, this rapist, this hacker, this spy. He's just going to manipulate me. And so they had to send me a couple of pieces of evidence and to ask me, almost to beg me to look at it. And when I did, I started to see that really the public narrative that we know about Assange has been fabricated. It's not true. The evidence is contradictory. In fact, the whole rape charges have been fabricated by the Swedish police, and the women who are supposedly his victims even said so in text messages that exist, that the police has railroaded and pushed them into fabricating this rape charge, which has kept him in confinement for 9 years and has completely turned the public opinion against him. And most importantly, it has turned away the focus of public opinion about what is really important, namely what Julian Assange has published, the secrets he has revealed, which has given evidence of war crimes by these states, war crimes that have been proven but have not been prosecuted. Instead, the person who has exposed these crimes is being prosecuted and faces 175 years in prison.
You talked about psychological torture that Julian Assange is facing. Could you provide some details on what you mean by that and what the effects are on a person?
Right. I think it's very important to know that torture really is a psychological process. It is the instrumentalization of pain and suffering in order to coerce a person, to make them confess or to intimidate them or to punish them, but it's always, in the end, you're targeting the mind and the emotion of the victim. You can do it by causing physical pain and affect the mind through that avenue, or you can do it through psychological manipulation. Psychological manipulation, psychological torture really aims at destabilizing and destroying the individuality and personality of a person to the point where they break and their will becomes completely manipulated by the torturer. And that obviously is what has been done to Julian Assange. You do that by first isolating the person completely from the environment and then exposing him to a completely arbitrary and threatening environment which overstimulates the nervous system to a point where he collapses.
There's a reporter called Florian Warwick. He works for Russia Today, and in every press conference that the German government holds, he cites your report and asks the German government whether they have read it. And every press conference that follows up, they say we haven't read it, or they deny it, or they say it doesn't exist. Putting this in context, how has your feeling been within the United Nations and member states like Germany? Have they taken your report seriously?
No, first of all, I have reported to the 4 states that were responsible for causing the persecution and torture of Julian Assange, and that's the United States, the United Kingdom, Sweden, and more recently also the new government of Ecuador. I have also informed other states through these official reports, but they have been very reluctant to actually look into the matter, because it would force them obviously to see the truth and to confront these other states about these wrongdoings. And that's very uncomfortable politically, so they're trying to evade it. That's why I'm not surprised at the attitude in the press conferences that you just referred to, but I have to say that in last November I was invited by the German Foreign Office to a meeting in Berlin to discuss this case. So I actually went to see the Human Rights Division of the Foreign Office of the Auswärtige Amt. And I asked them in the meeting, well, you asked for a meeting to discuss this case. Have you read my official interventions? And they say, no, we haven't read it, and frankly, we don't have the time to do that. And then that's why I also, in the Bundestag meeting, I was very outspoken and also said, well, that's not acceptable. You see, my reports are written to be read by states, and just because there's something uncomfortable in there, I think precisely Germany, with its history, there's one piece of history it can also be proud of. It's not the crimes it have committed in the Second World War, but how it has then dealt with it. That's one of the only states in the world that is actually bringing its own war criminals to justice, and that has done so, and it is proud of it. And so it should be an example. And instead of hiding and not confronting the truth, it should read these reports and then turn to Britain and Sweden and all these states and say, look, I know it's hard, but you owe it to your people to face the truth and tell the truth and deal with your war criminals and discipline them and reform your systems, and to make sure that you're respecting the rule of law in the future.
So my last question, for a lot of people, things become very abstract when you talk about national security and the United Nations. What do you tell young people who want to change something, support press freedom, support the inhumanity that's being levied on Assange? What can they do tomorrow to influence positive change?
Well, the first thing is this. When you're in a dark room, one person switching on the light will make everyone see, right? Don't look for the light somewhere else. Go and switch it on yourself. The second thing you have to realize is that you have power, because the state's power is not the property of the government. It is your property. You are delegating your power to the government, and they need to respond to you on how they're using this power, or they don't deserve it. Secrecy is precisely what prevents this from happening. So power plus secrecy means tyranny, because it disempowers the people. It prevents them from exercising control over power. So secrecy is the most dangerous ingredient of governance.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.